My name's Rebecca Rusch. I am a professional athlete and have been for going on 4 decades. So many awards and trophies and shiny things to my name. But really, the most important work that I do is actually to try to get more people involved with moving in nature and the outdoors. So yes, I am a professional athlete. I'm the founder of the Be Good Foundation. I am an event director, but it really all is morphed around me using my experiences on the trail and bringing more people into moving into the outdoors to really find the best version of themselves. So that was a long answer, but yeah, athlete and share or messenger is maybe sometimes what I call myself, or an explorer.
Sweet.
It's hard to put
Well,
one.
I'm Sue
Yeah.
Phillips.
Who are you, Sue?
Yeah, I know. It's like, at what altitude are we supposed to answer that one? Here's my attempt. I'm Sue Phillips. I'm one of the co-founders of Sacred Design Lab, and what I'm obsessed about every day is how to liberate our birthright wisdom as humans from the ancient past, around what makes for flourishing, well human souls and lives, and applying that in unusual places and circumstances so that we can flourish as individual people, as communities, but also at a cultural level. So I get to think every day and strategize about how to help programs and products and people and experiences manifest soul centeredness. I a little bit consider myself a public theologian as a vocation, someone who gets to frame and think about and invite people into different kinds of conversations in which the soul is centered. So that's a pretty good gig, I'd say. What do you think, Andy? Tell us about who you are.
Man, this is a tough act to follow. My name's Andy Walsh. I got a background in human performance. I spent about 30 years sort of trying to understand how people bring the best of themselves forward, and whatever way that may be. I think the easiest way to summarize it is over that time, just lots and lots of listening and watching people like the two on the call here, Sue and Rebecca, do what they do at the top of their game, and then trying to understand sort of how that happens when they have tough times, how they get through it, when they have great times, how they maintain it. And the best part about being a founder of Liminal, which is the organization we formed several years ago, to do this, to help the best sort of understand what the sort of pinnacle of their performance may be, but more importantly, I think try and democratize these lessons more broadly so that people who typically don't get access to these ideas and concepts get to share in them. And as you'll hear today, it's profoundly exciting, and the wisdom from the two speakers is really, really worth listening to. But what's really powerful, I think, is that it's very simple for the most part. And you can really just take basic principles and lessons from the likes of Sue and Rebecca and apply them in your own way to your own world. And it's just a great way to sort of navigate this journey we call life. So that's kind of my background.
Through the Liminal Collective, I got to meet Sue, Reverend Sue, and I've been, each time we talk, I've been kind of taken by the fact that I feel like our life purposes and where we come from are almost identical, except that I'm coming from an athletic movement, being outdoors, adventure scope, and you're coming from a theological religious scope. But when you describe your mission in life, it is exactly my mission as well, to help people flourish in the best way they can. And as an athlete for many, many years, I had a liminal moment about 6 years ago when I combined my sport of ultra endurance cycling to go ride the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to look for the place where my dad's plane was shot down in the Vietnam War. And that ride, what I thought was going to be an amazing adventure ride, actually turned into a much deeper soul searching and this sort of 6 year process of looking inward and using the template of being outside to look inside. And so this conversation is really exciting to me because, Sue, I feel like we're on a very similar path. And what's so interesting to me is that people are often putting athlete into a category or religion into a category or science into a category, but really we're humans and we are all in the same category here together, and all I think searching for, as you've stated on your website, our purpose and meaning. And so I'm very new in sort of dabbling in the world of religion and ancient techniques, but finding that a lot of the things I've done on the bicycle, and to give people context, I ride for 24 hours, 7 days. I do long expedition rides, which gives me plenty of time to think. And often when my body is the most tired, my mind and my heart and soul comes alive. And so I'm really intrigued by some of the ancient techniques that you bring into your work, but also trying to find that intersection between people who are athletes spending time outside and finding themselves spiritually as well. So um, I don't know if that resonates with you, but that's part of where I want to take this conversation of how do people find their sacred place wherever it is, and how do they put structure to it and make it something, because often our definition of religion or a church or going to a building and reciting certain things doesn't resonate with everyone. It doesn't resonate with me, but in your work, we recognize that spirituality is found in a lot of different places. So I don't know.
Mhm.
What does that make you think about? It wasn't really a question, more of like the intersection of the kind of exploratory work we're doing.
Wow, there is so much intersectional space around those questions, aren't there? It feels like this is such a disintegrating age. Life is so fast. There's so much coming at us. We're being bombarded with stimulation all the time. We're increasingly separated from some of the throughways of traditional wisdom. And we don't have as many intergenerational relationships. There's so much that's pulling us away from the sources that humans have traditionally relied upon to give us a decent handhold and how to just make it through every day. That I really think of it as being sort of atomized at a soul level. We're just being pulled in all these directions. And I feel like so much of what we have to do is just remember and reintegrate what is already there.
Mhm.
So for me, it's less of a it's more of a revealing process that you discover than it is actually discovering something new that's outside us. It's has more to do with just becoming more attuned, which is why I'm so captivated by your ride on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, Rebecca, because I have a feeling, and I want to wind up to ask you this question about when you think about what cleared away in order for you to bring this integration together. Again, integration is my word, not yours, and you may choose another one. But what do you feel like were the components of that? Just and if you don't have the right language, that's fine. You can just use like emotional language or whatever. But what was happening? Do you think? What were the ingredients?
That's a great question. And people have often asked me, why didn't you just go to the crash coordinates? You have the map coordinates. Why didn't you just go there in an easier way? And for me, I had to ride my bike 1,200 miles to go there, because I knew if I went there as myself right here, physically strong. I mean, I've spent my lifetime, practicing how to be really strong and resilient physically. And honestly, I needed to peel those layers of onion away. I need to pull off my armor, and so that I could be open to the experience. And the only way I knew how to do that at that time was to physically do something really hard so that my soul could be exposed. And you can see it along the trail, and I felt it as I got more and more fatigued. I could no longer put up the defenses, the traditional emotional armor that we all put up. It was just I was too tired, and so I was just like, okay, here I am, take me as I am. And so yeah, that it is a way that I expose my heart and soul, is through the physical body. And that isn't a new technique. I mean, a vision quest or long walks have often been part of many, many cultures. I just didn't really realize that was what I was doing until like your question, why did you have to ride it so far? And what were the things that allowed you to be open? Also, I was, it was a start to finish. And so it was something that had to be completed, really a pilgrimage for me of I'm going to do this trail and I don't know what I'll find. And what was really beautiful is I found things vastly different than what I expected to find. I expected to have this great adventure, which I did, but I found out about all the unexplored ordnance still left from the Vietnam War, all the people who are still suffering from a war, and a very distinct message from my dad to do something about that. And that launched the Be Good Foundation and to use my bike for more. So I really found my purpose, by this tree in Laos. And many people say, oh, it must have been closure to find your dad. And it's exactly the opposite. It was an opening of an awareness of, like you said, things that were in my soul my whole life, messages from my dad that I hadn't heard yet, but were coming in. And I really felt his presence in that place. I connected with the people who, knew the history of the crash. And it really opened to my eyes to how when people are gone physically, they're not gone from our lives. And my dad visits me now all the time, and I get messages from him all the time. Even my most recent bike crash, which was just a couple weeks ago, was a serious bike crash. I landed on my head down a little 10-foot cliff, and the impact on my helmet was exactly on the crash coordinates on that are printed on my helmet of my dad's crash site. And I was okay. I self-rescued, and I honestly felt like that distinct impact point right on those map coordinates were him saying, "You're going to be all right. I'm looking out for you." And so, to answer your question, like, so much awareness, one of me, but also the world around me and how connected we are as communities from and people who aren't in our lives anymore and who we'll never meet. And there were so many coincidences that happened there. The village chief in Lao, whose father buried my father, he's had dreams about me coming even before I came. And so, like, that's so magical to firsthand experience that. And as you know, you study this. There are many accounts of spirits or what happens after we die, but to be able to witness it myself was really special. And I'm a believer that we're all so connected in so many ways, which is partially why I really wanted to talk to you. I mean, have you had an experience like that in your life where you've you know connected with somebody who's physically gone but is emotionally with you every day?
I haven't, but this is what I love about these realms is that there are some. It speaks so many different languages with so many different manifestations. It's such a flexible space in the human minds and bodies and spirits. We have so many different ways of describing these realities. So many different elements. Our particular combination of reality is like attuned to get. And all of them are true as far as I'm concerned. There's just so much goodness there to be mined. That's one of the elements of all this I'm so captivated by, which is how the more we try to design a spiritual experience, the less likely it is that we're going to actually have one. And I'm going to wind up with a question for Andy because I'm very curious about how this, what I think of as a truism in religious and spiritual life, what I just said, that it's hard to design for. It's more about clearing away, although certain elements of clearing away can be designed. Um, I'm curious, Andy, you're somebody who's studied the elements of peak performance, so like the variables, the things you can control for, and the knobs you can turn. Um, when you think about what needs to get cleared away for peak performance, can you just what do you think those things are, and what do you think, if anything, they have to do with the soul?
Wow, you always have the best questions, Sue. You know, probably it's the historical perspective. I think the classic sort of breaking down of a performance into the component elements and focusing on them is very much that scientific method. And for many years, I think, as we knew nothing about sort of performance, we started to break into the different areas of the physical performance, the mental performance, the nutritional, medical. You could see disciplines and fields, and you could learn a lot. But to your point, I think speaks to probably the flip side and why we've been so vested in the sort of the spiritual element, and whatever that may mean in human performance, is because I think it's just not enough. That sort of takes care of pieces of the puzzle, but the whole soul, the whole human, and as you spend time watching these experts over the years, you recognize they're always doing these things for something beyond themselves. It's a I don't want to say a greater purpose, but it's a bigger purpose than just their insular sort of individual, and it may be their teammates, it may be a religious or a requirement, it may be their family, it may be they just feel the need to go out there. So I think for us, the idea that not I think it's Einstein. Not everything that's important can be measured. And I think we tend to drift towards what we can measure through the sort of wearables and the technologies, but I think it skips this whole other piece, and it's through work like yours, Sue, and watching Rebecca when it's really struggling and hard and challenging in these very tough environments. It's not like, all right, I'm defaulting back to things that we can point to. It's things that we can't point to that really fascinates us. And so when you're absolutely right. You can't design an experience. What we can do is Rebecca's piece is we put people in environments, we challenge them, we come at them with a lot. And especially if we do it in the natural world, we take you out into nature, and we call it kind of the day three sort of phenomena. So after about 2 or 3 days, a little exhausted, a little hungry, a little cold or hot, and just being immersed and away from the real world, you start to see them just let things go. And that's that, oh my God, you start to hear the conversations opening up, becoming richer and more meaningful. And you start to just watch the sort of person sort of shed whatever it is they're carrying. And that's fascinating to me, that when you think about, the soul and what's really important to people, like especially in the flourishing world, it's meaning and purpose, it's friends, it's belonging, it's community. It's got nothing to do with these other things that we think are so critical. Now, do they have a piece to play? For sure. But I really think, the reason we're so interested and fascinated by these sort of ancient techniques and then also the modern understanding of them, I think really is because it captures that holistic approach to allowing an individual to live that life they're looking for. And I always say, that people have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. So it behoves us to pay attention to things that have been worked through, and then add that little piece of technology in the last 20 or 30 years to maybe, but I think you can miss the point if you focus on that alone.
And we need help, don't
Sue,
we?
I want to go back to your question, and Andy hit on it. Is you asked, what were the elements for this a profound experience on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it's what was removed, not what was put there, but what was taken away. And in our worlds, we're full of distraction every second of every moment. And so, to Andy's point, and going into putting people into an environment where magical things can happen, you don't necessarily need a recipe, but you need to take away a lot of the distractions, maybe take away a little bit of the physical comfort to really kind of access the soul on the inside and get all that armor sort of put back and put away. And I think, Sue, to some of your work is, I mean, what is your input on the natural environment? Because I believe that's our universal language. Everyone in the entire world of anywhere responds to being in nature and the smell of flowers or a river running by them. And so I'm curious, in your studies, well, is nature like the one thing that can save us all, or the one religion in a way that we can all respond to?
Well, it feels like nature is a universal reference point for what matters, but also for being right sized. I think one of the ways I like to describe one way that we can feel in nature is being fully big and fully small at the same time. So just right sized. So we are both, teensy little elements of a vast cosmos and a vast landscape or a vast forest, but also we are fully a part of that larger thing. And I don't know how these things can coexist, but that's one of the captivations about talking about the space is how contradictory things can really so fulsomely be true. Um, so yeah, I feel like right sizedness is a part of what we can find in nature, and then reference points. But again, I think of nature as being less like a monolithic concept than like one of my favorite definitions of home is that where the trees look like they're supposed to. So there are these reference points that remind us who we are and where we come from, and that touch memories, and it's just such a complex evocation, really, of all of these internal things that have an external projection. If that sounds really abstract, I hope it doesn't, because we all know what it feels like to be in those spaces. But Rebecca, also, I just want to testify that I have, and I'm sure you two, both of you do too, but I have some really amazing travel experiences in East Africa where I was completely aware of being prey. So there's a lot about the natural world that wants to kill you, whether it's that 10-foot, and I don't want to speak light of an accident that sounds actually quite scary, but whether it's that 10-foot cliff or that ocean that Andy wants us to swim in, or that savannah. But there's an element of endangeredness that we encounter in nature that I think is a really important part of the story, where we're actually not in charge, and whatever illusions we have about our in chargedness turn out really not to be true if you just barely scratch the surface. So I'm actually curious about that, Rebecca, because I was following along with your Arctic um, pilgrimage, I'll call it, race, endurance trial, suffering, whatever. And I'm so curious about how extremity plays a role, the kind of extremeness plays a role in like turning up your awareness of some of these realities. What do you have to teach us about that? Because that's an experience I do not have.
Yeah, and it's a question I get a lot is why do you have to go do these really hard things? For me, it's a level of commitment of really rising to the occasion. And winter bike expeditions are kind of a new foray in the last 5 or so years. And it was really after going down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, I realized I missed the really committing big expeditions that I have done before. And there is there is a level of motivation and preparedness that you step up to if you're scared of something. And I am very scared of losing fingers and toes, and being in Arctic in winter is a very committing environment. So it's almost like, getting a PhD or really diving deep into studying something or doing that speech that really scares you. Fear is a powerful motivator, and the commitment level is what made me rise to the occasion. And, Andy can talk about this, in that, at some point, human performance, you're like, oh, I'm doing all right. I can go ride my bike for a few hours. And that gets a little boring, as with any learning. If we don't keep pushing ourselves and evolving, you're actually kind of not growing. I mean, the quote, if you're not growing, you're dying. And so there is this curiosity in me, one, to be able to go to places where not everyone can go, and to the awe and wonder of being in the winter in Alaska, listening to wolves howl, and not being afraid of it, is really special. So I don't take it lightly that I get to go to these places and I may never get to see it again. So it's the awe and wonder of the natural world, but then personally wanting to really continue to grow and push myself. And then third, to be able to try to document and share those stories to pull people in, that you can do something that's hard. And while in the moment it feels maybe not great and you might be scared and your fingers might be cold, but on the other side of it, you're a stronger, more resilient person. So again, it's using that physical atmosphere and challenge to become a more whole, complete person on the inside as well. I hope that makes sense. Andy, chime in, because you've taken a lot of athletes and entrepreneurs and CEOs into some physically really challenging positions, and you've talked about it, how it does, you do access the inner soul, or you do access something a little different than just feeling like, oh, I'm cold and my legs are tired.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great conversation. I think to what Sue mentioned before, I think there's that perspective element. Of you call it the right sideness. Or I think you use these tools, and I think just to pull it back, I think we drop them in, and we have a limited time frame. We don't have the luxury of just sort of letting it sort of fall away with a sort of a more of a natural process. So to your point, a challenging environment brings that perspective. Whether we've evolutions, the training evolutions in Africa, where you do a walking safari, and the first thing you know, if you start walking around out there, is that, oh, you're not paying attention to mortgages or bills or the color of my shoes. You're like, oh boy, I'm lower down the food chain, and it's not about scaring. It's just perspective shift. You're like, oh, hang on, now I'm going to pay attention to the environment. Now I'm going to cue into the natural world in a way, because my ears are picking up every rustle. If I see an animal in the distance, my default will be, oh my gosh, is that safe, or is it I'm harm's way? And I think when you balance that with the majesty and the awe of some of these vistas, and you have this, all right, I've got to pay attention to who I am and what I'm about, because it's important. And then I have this overwhelming vista, and then you look at the sort of science of it now with respect to the natural world, and the non-linear shapes just reset our brain, more efficiently. I think you start to get that profound. And like you said, we accelerate it by forcing it in. But I think if you spend any time out there, you get that perspective. And with that perspective becomes a moment of reflection. You suddenly look back on where you are, what you're doing, where you're from, all those sorts of things. And you suddenly go, wow, what I thought might have been critically important to me, or the most important thing, or where I'm focused, is maybe that perspective shifts. And I think that's all we can do in the human performance world, is we give you a different look at the world, whether through a physical challenge, a cognitive challenge, or just an experience. And I think that's the beauty of what you have done so many times, Rebecca. You've gone out there and found that perspective shift. And then what I love about Sue's world, maybe you can comment on that, is spirituality gives you a different look at the world. It gives you it gives you a perspective of something beyond yourself. I'm here looking at the world like this, and then if you look at all the sort of traditional sort of spiritual work, or the religious, sort of global religions, they're always about, in one respect, and be very clear, I'm not an expert like you are, Sue, but about a broader perspective of yourself as part of a bigger entity. And I think that's part of why it sort of gets to sit back and go, oh yeah, I should be kind. I should practice gratitude. I think these are the things that, again, we don't know the answers to yet, but we're fascinated, and why working in these environments with experts like yourselves is really where we're learning so much.
So Sue, I use the physical template to sort of shift my perspective, like Andy's talking about. How in your work? So how is somebody who's like, I'm not going to go ride the Iditarod Trail in Alaska. I'm just not going to do it. It's not my access point. How are you helping people find their soul and to shift their perspective, like you said, to answer the big questions of why we're here, what is our purpose? Like in your work, what is that entry to get there?
Well, life is a challenging environment for most people.
Yes.
So in reality, there's often very little we need to do. I mean, for countless people, physical and emotional suffering is a day-to-day experience. And so we don't have to conjure extreme situations, because there are people are already living them. And I'm not just talking about, trauma and elements like that, although that's certainly a factor. Everyday life, I think, erodes or can erode a sense of well-being and kind of trust in the order of things. And so I think what I've encountered, in both what I've studied academically, but really what I've encountered pastorally as a theologian, but also just as a minister and as a person who has served communities of real live everyday humans, is that life is hard, and we don't have to look very far for opportunities to survive difficult things, to try to marshal our resources for resilience, to remind us about what matters most, and to be able to recall those things at the times we're really suffering and struggling.
Yeah.
How to look to community for strength when we feel like we can't access it individually. Um, all those elements are things that people just try to find the threads and knit them together in ways that make for a decent life. So, as fascinated as I am by extreme performance, I feel like life is often an extreme performance for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
almost all of what we're talking about has day-to-day manifestations for everybody who's going to be listening along with us.
For sure. And I will say, a big reason when people ask why I go do hard things physically, it's actually to practice for life, because it is the one playground or training ground where we can go and practice the hard things, so that you're right, we have the tools for the everyday challenge of life. And I was, looking at your website and listening to some great podcasts with you recently. You simplified it down into the 3 B's of belonging, becoming, and beyond. And I I really resonated with that, and would love for you to talk about that a little bit. And in that, we all need the same thing for centuries, for as long as history has been written or talked about, and to now, from where we all need those 3 things. And I really resonated with that, so I would love to hear a little bit more about your 3 B's and what that means to you.
Well, I want to start by saying that one of the challenges of talking about spiritual and religious things in secular spaces and in a fundamentally secular American context is that you have to have concepts and language that are somewhat free from the accretions of history that weigh down so many traditional religious words and concepts. So I there is something about this construction, this triptych of belonging, becoming, and beyond that is just meant to do the job of being able to communicate hefty spiritual things in fundamentally secular language. So that's where I want to start. I mean, those of you who work in high performance or scientific spaces have a similar challenge of translation and making concepts sort of understandable enough that people can engage them. So that's a part of what's happening. But belonging, first of all, let me describe what belonging and becoming and beyond are. I think of belonging as being about claiming and being claimed by other people and by communities. So that claiming means I am reaching out, I'm extending myself to be a part of a community, and that community is reaching back to me, and all of the beautiful interactivity of those relationships. And becoming is the experience of becoming more of who we're called to be. And it's very important that call piece feels important, because it's about sort of our essence or our fundamental purpose, not just delivering our gifts, but sort of who we are and who we're becoming. And I really think of becoming as being a constant, lifelong process. It's not something we nail or ever really finish. And then beyond is the experience of feeling a part of something larger than ourselves. We try not to give that much name, but we know it's known by many names. Everything from theological concepts like God and Spirit and Allah and countless other names, just millions of names, I'm sure. But also, it can just mean that sense that we're a part of something longer, but we have no idea what to call it. And we actually don't have a lot of language for it, which in my world is most people I encounter are like, I know what you're talking about, but I wouldn't want to put a single name to it. So that's it: belonging, becoming, and beyond. And Rebecca, I think of this as being a way to talk about what human souls need, the fundamental, besides all the basic food, shelter, relationship. Uh, we need those pieces in order to be flourishing. I'm going to take a quick pause and say, Ben, I want to just do a tech check. I'm feeling like we're getting multiple microphone feeds, at least in my headphones, and I just want to make sure that the audio is clean. Okay. I don't know where it's coming from. I just want to make sure that it's not, I'm not screwing something up, or that we've got what you've got what you need. Great. Okay. Sure, sure. Okay. You guys, I'm sorry to interrupt the flow. I just wanted to make sure. So let me just offer a question then, because I want to ask Rebecca and Andy. Um, let me just give me a minute to think about what the right way to ask that is. One of the things I love about the space I get to occupy every day in my work and life is how idiomatic this language is, and how we can each come up with our own words to describe these fundamentals. And I'm just curious, just not so much as experts or like extreme athletes, but like just as souls, like what language do you use to describe these areas? Like what is belonging, what does that look like, what does that mean to you, or beyond, or whatever speaks to you most? What's your language for that?
Andy, you want to take that one first?
Yeah. I think for us, what I've tried to understand is it's that community is when I think of belonging, and I think your reciprocation of that I think is not as openly recognised. I think, oh, I'm part of a community, but I think it does actively require you to reach out. You do have to lean into that, to borrow that language. But I also think there's many communities that you sort of don't reciprocate very much, and I find that's very challenging. Sometimes you're part of a quote unquote a group, but it seems very one sided. So I think as we talk about it in the group, it's who's got your back, and in return, whose back have you got? And that's how we think about it in terms of, to your point, this is hard. Life is hard. Things are tough. And especially right now, given the last, 12, 18 months specifically. And I think that's why I think people are reaching out for more in person connection too. I think I just throw that in there, Sue. I'd like to you reflect on that maybe. That I think there's what they call digital communities, which I find completely unsatisfying. I don't. I just not. It just doesn't seem to work for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the connection back to people now are coming together again, and I think that gathering is sort of the way the communities kind of celebrate that relationship. That's my 2 cents. Rebecca, you got to jump in there and save me, because
That's
that's
great.
how I see it.
I mean, I agree with you, Andy, is that I would put for belonging, community is a word that makes sense. And we're all grasping and trying to form our communities, whether it's an athletic community or the liminal collective community or a religious community, whatever it's based on, or even your dog walking community. We're all grasping for that human connection. And it is a challenge in a digital world. And there are some good sort of supplements, during the pandemic of being able to connect digitally like we're doing right now, but it isn't the same as is being with someone in the same space. And so, yeah, that belonging I would put as community, but yeah, belonging is deeper in that it is a give and take, like you say, Sue. And I find my community in nature. It's often with my dogs, and the becoming, to me, the word I would have put to that, before I found your amazing word, is, has been evolution or growth or learning. And as you said, we're hopefully continuing to grow all along. And then that beyond, the third word, I think that's the one I'm on my new journey to try to articulate, of after riding and finding my dad and connecting with myself and others, like, what is that thing that's out there? And um, so, yeah, I think that third point really is where to hone into of how are people finding that now. I think everyone is searching, like you said, for the same three things. I find for me, there's three things also that cannot be replaced by digital, or AI or anything like that. And that is moving your body, being in nature, and physically connecting with other humans. And that's where I sort of go to try to feel these things. But I'm also recognizing that, like, through your work, people are trying to find their own spiritual center or their own spiritual community, whatever that is. You don't have to call it religion, and so I'm curious how you're seeing that people are connecting, and where do they go? I mean, I think I listen to you talk about how it's sort of like DIY spirituality right now, and they might take meditation from this app and something from this app and something from that, but it doesn't have this cohesive feeling of a structure or a leader or teachers or mentors or elders that are showing you the way. So I would love you to expand a little bit on what people are doing now and how they can sort of do it better.
Wow, it's such a dynamic time in a sort of American religious life because more and more of us are experiencing freedom from the pathways that our people and our parents, our communities have pursued in the past around these questions. But we're used to thinking about freedom in a very particular way, which is a kind of liberation. But I actually think one of the things that's lost, as free as we are to pursue our own bespoke elements of religious and spiritual expression, which is magnificent freedom that I have pursued as the tradition I'm a part of, there's actually a lot of freedom in not having to build something from scratch. Actually, freedom within a framework may be an ideal way for us to think about this because not having to figure everything out from scratch is actually one of the fundamental knowledges embedded in a lot of spiritual and religious practices because I can't do that. I would have been lost if I hadn't stepped into my own Unitarian Universalist tradition. If I hadn't known that Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Margaret Fuller are my people, the way they shaped and thought about questions of the day, even though they're 19th century relatively elite figures, I took on some of how they framed the questions and the landscape and elements they drew from to help me to know where to look. Because let's face it, I mean, it's a big world out there and we need help. And so I think some of the challenge for us is that we are free to choose, and yet we lack the touch points, those like cairns on the side of the pathways that you all encounter in the wilderness. We don't have many of those in our spiritual and religious lives. And that's some of what's lost when we assemble it from all these disparate pieces. We've lost a through line and a pathway in the name of freedom that I think is a very, very great thing to lose in the meantime. I could talk for a long time about, okay, so what do we do about that? But meanwhile, I don't want to lose sight of what is lost in the atomization of assembling an individual spiritual life. Andy,
But
I see you reacting to that. What's being conjured for you?
there's so much there, and there's two things. And I, unfortunately, like I said, I'll have to jump in a minute. But there's two things. One, that freedom within a framework, I think, is you say it so lightly, like many of the things you say, Sue, which have depth to them as you listen and you sort of go back and you go, wow, I wonder if Sue meant that. What you said really resonated with me because it's that idea that even if you do go down, well, my experience has been you go down a path of trying to figure this all out, and when you find that something you've kind of think you figured out on your own, and you relate it back to the sort of the sort of religious conversations or the spiritual conversations, there's also a freedom in the contentment. Then you go, I thought I'd figured this out, and I'm the first person ever to do it. But then you reflect over and you go, oh my God, they've been doing this for centuries, or thousands of years. And there's a real contentment, I think, in that. And that's another sort of freedom. You kind of go, oh, wow, I wasn't crazy and out there. Like, this has been going on. I just never saw it, or I never heard it, or for whatever it may be. Along those lines, though, I want to drop back to something here. Probably the last thing I can ask you today, Sue, which is thank you both for letting me sit in this. This has been magnificent. But you said in becoming, and you said it to me before. You and again, you throw this little line out there, and I don't know how many people pick up on it. It's the calling of who you can become, not who you are. I love that distinction you make on becoming. It's not who you are, or even better at what you're doing right now. There's this sort of idea around, and I'd love you to unpack it for the group. It's who could you become? There's a little question there about what's possible, and I love that possibility that you bring to that statement, which it resonated with me the first time you said it. So, would you dig it a bit deeper on that?
I can try, and it's such a complex idea because I mean the way it works in sort of in my heart, not just my sort of we'll call it the expert brain, is that I don't know how this can be true, but it feels true to me that we are both completely sufficient as we are in the world, and yet we are a part of an evolving creation, and the whole world wants to become. That's what the world around us, what nature teaches us, is this constant becoming. And so these things are like they just interplay constantly in our everyday lives and in my individual psyche. Frankly, I mean, I'm likely to vacillate between I am good as I am, and it's just about remembering that, and oh my God, there's so much I don't know. I am a crappy person. I did that thing I'm embarrassed by. I mean, I cannot be the only one on this call that vacillates between those two things. And I feel like that's the mystery of becoming. On the one hand, this like foundational sufficiency. In my tradition, we refer to that as the sort of inherent worth and dignity of every person that nothing can touch. We're born to belonging in that fundamental way. But at the same time, we're also called to become and to learn and grow and evolve. So there it is, and yet another kind of paradox at the heart of our soul questions. But I mean, it feels like, Rebecca, you must encounter this all the time as an extreme athlete because you must be very focused on it, sort of improving your performance. And yet, my guess is that if you didn't have some understanding of yourself as already good enough, you would struggle and suffer as an athlete because
Yeah,
you
I
wouldn't
mean,
want to tie your
concepts.
sense of
Yeah. We're not alone in the paradox as you talked about. I think most of us vacillate between confidence and lack of confidence. I could do more, I should do less. I think that's what's missing in not having a bit of structure like you talked about. And it's the same thing with training. You have a coach, you have a structure, you some days are hard, some days are easy, but you continue on a very disciplined path to sort of get to the end. And there really isn't ever any end. And I mean, I think that's again back to the heart of the structure as we're all trying to improve, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. What is that structure in that community like you can find in a training group, but for your heart and for your head? And
yeah.
I think that's what's interesting to me is how does your training structure look so that when you have those days where you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, what process are you falling back on where I can go to my physical training coach or to Andy or somebody and ask a question? Where are you going for those sort of life questions that aren't physically related? I
I
guess to
apologize.
yourself
I've
because
got.
you're
I have to leave. I'm so
Bye,
sorry because
Andy.
but this has been extraordinary. There's so much here. I think we should continue this at another. Yeah, volumes one, two, three. I think there's so much here. But Sue, thank you as always for being so gracious with your time. I look forward to our event next week. And Rebecca, as always, thanks for inviting me into this conversation today.
Thanks for
It's always
coming.
profound. I learned so much. So thanks to you both. I apologize
Be
again. I
well.
had to do
Be
this.
well, Andy. Take
Okay.
care.
Motivation, it's a menu. You have to have a lot of different things, and it has changed over time. Initially, it was to learn a new skill or craft, to go exploring, to see what was around the next corner. I distinctly remember as a little kid learning to ride my bike, and it expanded my universe from you know the suburban street in Downers Grove, Illinois, to the next block over and the next block over, and eventually around the world. And so initially, what motivated me and still does is a curiosity to see places and to go places, and using my body in that way where I can meet other cultures, I can meet other people. So there's very much an explorer motivation that has never died. That's the strongest motivation. But yes, there's also, to keep my body healthy so that I can, live as long as possible. And because I love what I do too, like Sue does. And so there's a health motivation, there is an explorer motivation, there is a motivation in that, a challenge and a commitment to something and a process. And there's also, sport is where I find a lot of my community that looks very much like what perhaps a religious community might look like, without the religious structure, but people are committing to show up. They share their highs and lows. They're supporting each other. We have social events and gather in that way. And so sport is often that for me. When I'm alone out on the trail, the motivation is often from within, of, being a stronger version of myself. Even when I'm alone, and this happened in Alaska, I knew that people like Sue and my mom and other people were watching my little satellite tracker dot move along the map. And so while I was alone, I didn't feel alone, and I felt this immense energy from other people. So there's also a motivation to be a good example, and to be good not just for myself but for other people around me. So if I can inspire somebody to be resilient and strong and keep going, I feel a responsibility to that. So often that is the motivation. When I don't have any internally, it comes from external, and that's pretty powerful part of the community.
Rebecca, I love how comprehensive your answer to that question is. In like these different realms, you have different motivations, and that you have to have many of them to conjure up when you need them in different contexts. That's just genius. I mean, I am 100% sure that that is part of why you are such an elite athlete, is because you can name, conjure, and apply, and then actually be soothed by and or motivated by any one of those things. It's like a total toolbox of motivational tools. I'm sure that's a part of your genius. It's amazing to hear about.
Well, thank you.
It's
And I mean,
fantastic.
everybody needs a toolbox, whether it's anything you're exploring, whether it is spirituality or training or education. Nothing's going to work every time. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
part of my curiosity with your work too, is how do we have more tools for resilience and confidence? And I don't know where I'm going. There's no cairns, there's no trail marker. What do I do? How do we have more of those life tools? And, I try to take what I learn on the trail and bring it into life, but you've got a better practice of a different kind of toolbox than I do, that I'm really interested in.
Well, I mean, let me ask you a quick question. What function does practice have in your performance? What does practice
100%.
do? What?
Yeah. You have to show up consistently day after day after day. It's not a one-off thing. And I could win a race or do something, and then the very next day, the practice for the next thing starts.
Yeah, the showing up piece. I mean, there's another kind of triptych in my world that I think about what makes a practice a spiritual practice, and it's a combination of intention, attention, and repetition. That's what differentiates, reading a book from really looking at a sacred text. Intention, attention, and repetition. So it's intentionally choosing to do something on purpose with a purpose in mind. It is a quality of attention that kind of brings more of oneself or one's spirit to the effort. And it's doing it over and over again. I mean, we practice in sports, in athletics, because we want to be able to, we have muscle memory, so that we can more reasonably rely on a certain skill set, and because we can improve those skills over time. Spiritual practices are exactly the same. The reason that we call them spiritual practices is so that they're there when we need them.
Yeah.
And because there's inherent value in doing them as we go, but it's exactly the same principle. And fortunately, human community has come up with like thousands of spiritual practices. I mean, virtually anything can be a spiritual practice if you do it with intention, attention, and repetition, and assuming, I like to think, that there's some good for yourself and for other people at the heart of the intention. But I kind of think you could choose. There are so many different languages of practice we can speak as humans. You could choose a lot of different things and succeed very well with some of the questions that you, Rebecca, have asked, and I'm sure many others do. It's more a matter of throwing the dart in the dartboard and then sticking to something. I'm not a big fan of taking a taste of a lot of different things and then moving on as if it's supposed to hit you like a lightning bolt on the first day. We would never assume that would be a reasonable approach to practice on a mountain bike skill.
Mm-hmm.
Why would we ever assume that would work for like meditation on the first time we sit for 10 minutes?
Yeah. So what is your, and I know it'll be different for everyone, what does your daily spiritual practice look like? Your training.
Well, yes, I mean, I need simple things and simple doable things in my life. So my wife and I get up at 6:30. Well, we get up earlier, but at 6:30 we come together in the space in our house that we call the chapel. And we run through about a 25-minute reflection process that includes short meditation and music and reading a piece of text and then rereading the piece of text in both of our voices, offering a reflection, doing a short like meditation or prayer, playing the piece of music again, and then blowing out the candle and going about our day. So almost every day we start with that experience. And I mean, what it does is it grounds us in what matters most throughout the day. And it gives us some tools to stimulate fresh thinking about what matters and who we are and want to be. And I'd say for a 25-minute investment every day, that's a lot of jobs.
Yeah.
So that's my primary spiritual practice.
And how did you design this and put the elements in together?
Well, all of the elements that I mentioned, you'll recognize as being a part of a lot of religious and spiritual traditions. Lighting candles, going to a separate physical environment. We do it in the dark, except for candlelight. So, kind of manifesting in a physical environment, the kind of liminal space. Picking a wisdom text to reflect on, listening to it more than once. So, giving yourself a little extra time to have it work on you, to give some voice to what you're thinking about or what's passing through. So, like a little processing time, conjuring intention in the form of, in our case, a sort of centering prayer. I mean, all these are really fundamental tools in the toolkit of spiritual practices, and we just put them together out of desperation, but also we copied. I mean, all this is a very common kind of white Protestant-y approach, which is our religious idiom. So a lot of those elements just come from our traditions. But honestly, we did it out of desperation, following political developments in this country that were devastating to us personally, and we were so desperate for some kind of space to lament and suffer and understand that we had to do something. So that was the motivation, was an extremist moment.
Yeah.
But you probably have your own version of that. Of like, and it doesn't have to be so engineered. I mean, I realize this sounds my wife and I are both ordained, and we have this is like making breakfast for us, but that would maybe be a little much for a lot of people.
I mean, I love that. I mean, what I know about you is you are pulling and looking at practices from many of the major religions. There's not, necessarily one, and they are all very, very similar, at least from what I see. There are a lot of similar rituals and as your morning routine that you put together. And I mean, I read a little bit about Unitarian Universalism, which I didn't know what that was until I met you and started looking into it. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about it, because I think as people are looking at, you know, I grew up, you know, this way, and I had to go to church as a kid and it didn't really resonate with me, but some of the things did. And oh, Buddhism resonates with me a little bit, and this resonates a little. And so I'm really interested in the fact that I feel like you're pulling wisdom from a lot of different places instead of saying this is right, this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
Um, Yeah, I think that is true. That in fact is what Unitarian Universalism does a lot of, and it makes me want to issue a little bit of a caution at the beginning to recognize that there's a very fine line between giving ourselves access to a lot of traditions and sort of taking things and taking them out of very specific cultural contexts and using them for our own purposes without respect for where they came from or what they're intended to do.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a danger that underlies this entire conversation is how do we approach this kind of um, engaging these spiritual practices in a way that has integrity and frankly honor from the deep traditions out of which they come.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really interesting work being done now on how successful it actually is to pluck an individual part of a practice, like invoking the divine name in Islam, for example. Can you really pluck that out of the vast cosmology that is Islam and expect it to even work? Forget about the moral implications. So I think it's important just to touch on that as a part of our conversation. Not, Rebecca, in any way to suggest that you are somehow guilty of a violation, but it's something I think about a lot as I talk about this stuff.
Well, and you're studied in this, so that is why I wanted to ask you. We're all like, well, what do? We aren't studied in all of these different religions, perhaps, but yet we are all
Hmm.
still seeking,
Hmm.
belonging, becoming beyond. And how
Hmm.
do we put together without, studying theology? How do we put together something that is our own spiritual practice that works for us, but that honors the traditions of people that have
Yeah,
come before us? I think it's a big
I,
question.
it is, isn't it? I appreciate the way that you've put that together. I mean, my advice, first of all, is to understand what's in your nature. One of my favorite elements of Hinduism and yoga traditions out of Hinduism, which of course they all have religious roots, is that the different yogas emphasize different aspects of personality type. So some are really kinesthetic, some are really mystical, some are um, really insight oriented. And this doesn't happen by accident. It happens because different humans respond differently to different elements like personality types. So that's my first bit of advice is um, look at options that work for you as a human, knowing that the ones I'm going to choose are not any better or worse than the ones that you're going to choose, Rebecca. I have friends for whom singing is everything. All of their practices have to do with singing themselves and with other people. Magnificent. In my world, I have sort of a monastic introverted heart. So you're always going to find me with like a piece of text and like a journal or reflection. For other people, they're going to want to hurl themselves out into the world and like just have really focus on service, on identifying where there are people in need and trying to show up with their gifts to help. So there are countless ways. But remember, if we think about intention, attention, and repetition, that's probably more important. Not probably, I think those are more important than what you choose, as long as you've met the bar of that what you choose is in line with your nature. Don't try to go against your nature. If you can't sit still for more than 10 seconds, do not pick meditation, even if it sounds like it's really cool and you wish you could be like a bodhisattva. Don't, that would just be painful. Don't do that. If it's wicked hard, it's not the right one. It's not supposed to be painful.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be sustaining. So, how do you respond to those that beginner, the starter package of approaching a practice?
I love that intention, attention, repetition. Super important in anything that we do. I think many people have intention. They don't necessarily put the attention in it because we're getting,
Mhm.
again, bombarded by so much distraction in our world. So doing a little study and then repetition, and that's probably the process I'm in. Is the intention is absolutely there. I'm learning a lot of different practices and trying to hone in on the one that works for me. Physically, my sort of moving meditation has always been being in nature, whether it's walking my dogs or riding a bicycle for a very long time, or climbing a mountain. That is what I found as a young person, is being outside and moving. And that feels spiritual to me. The next phase of that is putting a little more education and intention and process to it, because I did just recently have a bike crash, and I've been forced to be still, and I realized that you know I need to take what I know in movement and be able to find a practice in stillness that can
Mm,
offer me the same insights, the same access to my soul, the same sort of support that I find outdoors moving, that I can't always do that. And so that is where the sitting still and dabbling with meditation and doing some cool sound vibrational therapies, or some things that I've been getting into with a crystal bowl, and like feeling that sound is quite intense. But I'm on a new journey here, which is kind of exciting, to take what I know in the outdoors and in movement, but to bring it to still and internal, so that I don't have to go ride 1,200 miles to access my soul, so that I can find that on a daily basis, like you said, with a practice that is meaningful for me.
I
Probably
love
our
it.
most spiritual practice right now is my husband and I walk the dogs every morning, and
Yeah.
we don't take the phone. We live in a natural environment. We go down by the river. I often just sit at the river. The dogs sit next to me, and sometimes I meditate, sometimes I just hang out, but that's a ritual that I really cherish with my husband and my dogs, and being in nature and being undistracted and just listening to the birds. And so that's a pretty regular ritual that we do every day. That really does every morning and every evening. And so for any of you who have pets, leave your phone, go for a walk. I will say that often animals know the right way, and we know the right way too. We just
Mm,
aren't always
mm.
listening.
I love that. I also love how you lifted up that attention might be the growth area for a lot of folks, and you're so right. Like at any given point in our life, it's just good to know what are we working on. Is it the discipline of repetition? Is it just understanding what we want? That's a sort of more discernment orientation that's focused on intention. But there are so many handholds. Like if you're, I'm just going to make this up, but if you're really interested in kind of working with your attention, there are so many examples out there of communities, religious and spiritual communities' efforts to shape people's attention, like the Rule of Saint Benedict or the Eightfold Path, or there's like endless ways that communities have attempted to interpret and share and steward qualities of attention. Go look at some of them, and
Yeah.
just see what timber and what shape they take, to see what you might be able to learn about sitting by the river with your dogs. There's so much inspiration out there. It's such a well trod set of questions. We can always feel ourselves accompanied by tradition if we just go look a little bit.
I mean, Andy said it earlier, is that the answers are all there. Like humans have always asked these questions and have written things down and shared their wisdom. So we don't have to figure it all out on our own. We maybe just
Hmm.
have to look in some areas that we haven't looked before. And
Yeah.
I think religion has, in modern day, maybe a negative connotation for some people who have their childhood memories, or really strict dogma or things that they had to do. And the definition is expanding. I would love to hear what you think of, like, what do people think of spirituality, religion? Are you religious? It can almost be political even at this point in our world.
Yes, it is political in
Yeah.
our world for sure. Um, well, uh, so much to say about that. In general, when people talk about religion, they're talking about institutionally mediated um, beliefs and hierarchies and that sort of thing. And in general, when they're talking about spirituality, they're more talking about sort of an ineffable collection of practices or vibes. In truth, some studies have shown that people actually don't know what they mean when they're talking about spirituality or religion. So it's awfully hard to know what people's experience really is, because the definitions are all over the map. So let's just say that personally, I'm agnostic on what language people use. I use them interchangeably, and you'll hear me using them both, because I think that just does justice to more people's experiences. But um, the damage that's been done by a lot of the world's religions is real, and the trauma from that damage lives in people's everyday lives, including mine, and probably many people who are listening to this. It's for real. So no attempt to re-knit some of these elements can be done for a lot of people without passing through some serious healing, um, understanding what that damage has been, what it's done to us, and what we need to do to kind of work through that. Some people will never be able to access this wisdom because the resistance is too great, partly and almost always because the harm has been so great. Um, People put up a lot of defenses against this stuff, whether it's kind of like uh, orthodoxies of all kinds. I mean, I've seen atheists who are as orthodox in their theologies as I have seen evangelical Protestants. So, it's more a matter of mindset, I think, than specific theology. But I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer, but to me, it's like a huge start. To talk about religion and spirituality and their definitions is like talking about the stars in the sky. It's
Yeah.
just extremely wide.
Well, and that's what I love about Sacred Design Lab. It's simple, like becoming or belonging, becoming, and beyond. And that takes away, like you said, maybe the historical trauma or whatever stereotypes we had about some of these things, and that we're all searching for the lifelong questions of like, why are we here? How do we thrive and flourish? And I mean, that's what I love about the way that you communicate about religion, is that it's a human wanting to feed their soul. We all want that.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
will go back to that universally. We all want that. And
Mm-hmm.
why we
Mm-hmm.
can't come together on that aspect. I guess it starts with yourself first, and then maybe the close, people around you, and forming a community or joining a community that feels supportive. And then maybe it expands to the world eventually, to the
Mm-hmm.
world at large, but one at a time. I guess, I mean, I would think about if anyone listening here, and that's what I love about your message, is it's as discouraging as the world can seem right now, and people are finding spirituality out of need. Like you said, you developed a spiritual practice because you needed to cope with what was going on in our world, what is going on with our world. The same reason I go exercise in nature is it's a coping mechanism. But I think we can even go deeper, and perhaps I get you on a dog walk one day, you get me into a, religious spiritual ceremony, to listen to one of your sessions. That I think that would be amazing, again, to find the intersections where where we're more similar than we are different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of shared ground here, isn't there? And even though there are so many theological differences among us, um, so many life circumstance differences, there are some core bits, some core needs that are widely shared, and there is a great comfort in that, isn't there?
What brought you to do this kind of work and study?
Desperation and
Hmm.
curiosity.
Hmm.
I don't know how else to put it. When I was young, when I was in eighth grade, I went to a school that was on the campus of the Washington National Cathedral, which actually that blueprint is the south face of the Washington National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. It's the sixth largest Gothic cathedral in the world, and it was under construction. in the 80s when I was a student there. And I didn't grow up going to church, but I was captivated by whatever it was that people believed, that they wanted to build something that amazing. And that curiosity has never left me. I'm so curious about it. In fact, my own theology, I am not a theist. So technically, I do not believe in God the way most people would describe God. But I have no trouble devoting my life to these questions because of whatever it is in the human spirit that makes us reach for whatever that building represents. And if that sounds too dry, it's not. I'm also like a desperate human trying to make meaning of my life every day. Trust me. And I find that these practices and these ideas and occupying this space, this philosophical space, helps me to do that. So it's very functional when it comes right down to it. So there you have it. I mean, I don't know. I guess people would answer that question differently, but those are mine. Something about desperation and something about curiosity.
I mean, those are two really motivating factors in that motivational menu is desperation and curiosity. I mean, they're powerful brain chemicals are released, when we are curious about something and we're interested in something. And then also, yeah, when we're scared and afraid and alone, that's pretty motivating too, to find a solution. So
Don't you know?
yeah, it's not
It's
that
real.
different. And I do think we need to go on a hike or a bike ride or something if you're willing. I would
I'm
love
ready.
kind of do this kind of talk in nature. Would be really fascinating. I guess that's one question. Do you do any of your teaching or your work outside?
I don't, but I'll tell you, one of the things I'm captivated about as a concept is event chaplaincy. I think if every bike race, endurance race had a chaplain on hand to listen to people at the end of the day and to help them process what's happening for them and gave some shape to a reflection while people were doing that, I can't begin to imagine how much power might be added to events. That's an example of an experiment we could do to just see what that could look like.
I love that. You're officially invited to Rebecca's Private Idaho in September. We have 1,500 people, and we had at the end of this race, I implemented a few things. We had a gong, we had a sort of meditation area, rejuvenation area where people could go in and have a sound bath. So we implemented some of those things at the end of the bike event, and it was fantastic. So I would love to have you there, and yeah, allowing people, because it's a big experience to go ride 100 miles or 20 miles or whatever it is for you. But then you come back to this community of 1,500 people who all did the same thing as you did, and you had your unique experience. But it is a very interesting collective group of humans that come together there, and adding that a spirituality element or a guidance, really, because I think people are having a spiritual experience out in nature, but they don't know, as I didn't, they don't know what it's about or what they're feeling.
Yeah,
So it would be amazing to have you there as
100.
kind of a guide for that process.
I love it because witness, I mean, so much of religious practice, especially around religious professionals, is about witness. So when somebody is listening to your experience, it totally changes your internal experience of your own experience. That's the value we're partly talking about. It's not just rituals, although those are wonderful. It's building in a witness back that can just alchemize insights in just a profound way.
I'm really excited about this concept. So put it on your calendar, please.
You got it.
That would
You
be
got it. What
amazing.
a pleasure, Rebecca. Thank you for your initiating this conversation and just for being so curious and so well prepared. I'm really touched by the way that your precision is overlapping with your longing to figure some of these things out. It's just I recognize it just as human to human. Thank you for that.
I'm super excited about the research I've done on you, and to go a little deeper and listen to your podcast. And if anyone hasn't gone to Sacred Design Lab, it's fascinating. And Sue, you have some great interviews. I mean, I thank you for letting me pick your brain a little bit and your soul, and having a look in there. I hope this is the first, but hopefully not the last of our experiences together.
I hope so. Be well.